What books do I got? I got so many books. I love
You
books.
you just have them in your hand.
Well, I got more. I also got these. This
Wait, who
Halmos book, like I feel like this Halmos book like opened my eyes. Uh,
to what?
because almost to the mathematical conception of infinity. Because I'm not a mathematical ignoramus. I've been kind of mathy for a long time as, physicist training. And you deal with infinities like 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus so on, is -1 over 12 and stuff like that. Um, um, and there's just been sometimes I come across math stuff and I have a conception of infinity. I'm like, what are they even talking about? Like what they're saying just doesn't make any sense. I think one example that you've loved, and maybe it was a previous episode, is you're talking about compactness and like graphs that it's compact. You can use
All right,
compactness
all
to
right.
say something about infinite graphs.
Mm-hmm.
And then, uh, and so compactness is like, yeah, for every finite set of axioms or something, if
Yeah,
that's
yeah. If you
consistent.
have
Yeah,
any arbitrary set of axioms, completely
yeah.
arbitrary, some collection, maybe infinite. Um, if every finite subset of that is consistent, then the union of all those axioms together is also consistent.
Okay, see, this is exactly, I think this is exactly the conversation that was like my conception of infinity and the mathematician conception of infinity are like completely like we aren't even talking the same world. And this book is sort of the one that, because when you say like, oh yeah, every finite subset of these things, like the only thing infinity could even mean to me is like you have some process that's getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and then we sort of talk about the like it, if it doesn't really matter how big the process gets or how big a number gets, that's sort of the infinity that's happening. But like set theory is like closing the infinity, and it's all about like, well, that's not the entirety of what set theory is about, but it's like there is this infinity, and then you take higher and higher infinities. And I've also been vaguely
Yeah,
aware of
it
cardinalities
takes
and things, but
seriously the concept of there is a set that you can point to, and that set is infinite.
but
What's
also the set is like abstract. It's like this un really, even though you can kind of probe it and ask about like elements of it, it's like not like a finite set in Python or something where I can have a finite set of one, two, three, four, and like know all the elements in it. It's really like this abstract X, and then like you can sort of through deduction figure out these various things about it, that this is in it or
Yes,
that's
yes,
in it or
yes.
that's in
But
it.
yeah, of course, to a mathematician, that's the only way they know anything,
I know,
right?
but that makes
Is through
no
deduction.
sense. That's
So
like
they can
insane.
say, take the set of all odd numbers, and they're like, this is a completely explicitly given set, right? And we're like, yes, because I could build an algorithm that gives you the nth odd number for a given n.
Yeah,
But to mathematicians, they're like, no, I don't care. I've described what it means to be an element of the set, right? It's almost like they have an API that only grants you membership, right? You can only test for membership.
yep,
Whereas you want an API that takes in an n and then outputs n elements of that set.
yep. That's right. There is something very abstract data type about this, which is no coincidence, I think, from where the concept of, well, it's a confusing, like the connection of the mathematical concepts historically to the computer concepts.
Yeah, what's kind of
Like,
interesting. So just figuring out what it meant to be finite was a little bit fiddly, right? The
I still don't know exactly. I ask this and then I forget like what a good definition of finiteness is.
Right, so there's
Um,
two, and the two unfortunately are intuitionistically distinct, which is a little bit nerve-wracking.
hmm,
The one I think is the funnest is the Dedekind definition, which is a set is finite if and only if it does not have a bijection with a proper subset, right? So if you can't
Hmm.
somehow fit it inside itself strictly, then it is finite. So first of all, you're right. So Dedekind, yeah. So this definition is it defines finite set as not infinite, and it gives you a direct definition of infinite, which is crazy, right? You'd expect
Hmm.
it to be the opposite. Um, and and also it's weird, right? Like a bijection with a subset of yourself, you're like, this is absurd, right? And it, it's uncomfortable and it's not even obvious, even if you're a mathematician, it's not obvious that infinite sets really have this property. Um, and indeed, if you try to build a countable subset of that, you're going to need choice at some point. And so that's not great. That kind of sucks.
Hmm.
And the other version, which is more boring but somehow a little bit more workable, is a set is infinite if there is if there is, an injection of the natural numbers into it, or rather, a set is finite if it is in bijection with the set with n elements for some n.
Yeah.
Okay, but that means you need to for some n a natural number, but that means you already need to have the natural numbers somewhere in there. And in set theory, it's kind of tedious. You define the natural numbers as being all the ordinals that are smaller than the first limit ordinal. So all the ordinals such that um, all the members of it are not limit ordinals, and a limit ordinal is an ordinal, what is it, that is not a successor, right? So if so defining ordinals is already a little bit finicky. It's these like a transitive set of transitive sets, so that's kind of confusing. And then defining a limit ordinal is just saying, oh, every member of me is a successor, and then you're saying, hey, if that is true, then I'm a natural number. And then, basically I'm finite if there's a bijection with one of these guys. Um, and you can sort of tediously prove that things work out pretty well, that the things that you build, are going to be finite sets, and they're going to be finite sets in a very structured way, and they sure do look like natural numbers. And it sure does seem that what you've defined here are things that are closed under successors. In some sense, that's what you want to do, right? You want to define a successor operation, and then you want to take uh, the smallest set of things that is closed under successors. Now, that might not be a set. That might be something else. But it is certainly you can certainly find a predicate that says any set that's closed under successors will contain this set, or any class that's closed under successors will contain this particular set. And you call those things finite. Does that kind of make sense? It's kind of what
Yeah.
you do in type theory too, right? You just say, hey, there's some set, it has a zero, it has a successor operation, and those are the only ways I can really build it.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and then this
It,
closure, right? The smallest set that has these things is exactly the recursor in some sense.
yeah, it makes sense. I mean, it makes sense that you talk about a finite set, it'd be like, oh, give me a thing that defines the size of it, and the size of it is a finite number. That's like a very direct
Yeah,
definition, kind
it's a
of.
little circular, right?
It's a little circular. It's also a code smell, is kind of what it is, because like, why are you bringing integers into it? A little is, and that's why the Dedekind one is kind of nice.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. You don't really have to bring integers into it because you could just sort of say um, a finite set is either the empty set or a set that contains only see, only a finite number of finite sets. That's a little bit hard to define. Uh, yeah, I'm sorry. No, I take that back. You need to define what it means. Yeah, you need to somehow find some class of finite sets. And it's not clear to me you can define a finite set like in general, without saying, ah, it's in bijection with this thing that's only finite.
Yeah. I
So
just
you could have a different definition, but it still has to be kind of a well-controlled set. And it's, yeah, you can't get them all at once. I agree. I agree. This is kind of annoying.
you just have to build this whole other apparatus. I mean, I'm in the context of like I'm building this very weak proof assistant at the moment, and we were just talking about like
Am I gonna
finite
have to
sets.
tick the box that says paid promotional material in this
Yeah.
podcast?
Why didn't say the name?
Yeah, it's
Uh,
it's called Knuckle Dragger.
it's called Knuckle Trigger.
I expect my
Wait,
check in the mail.
what are we supposed to actually be talking about? Are we talking about what we're supposed to be talking about? Set theory?
Yeah, I mean, we're going to talk about the continuum hypothesis and
Oh
the
boy.
independence thereof, but we're building up momentum very slowly. I don't
Yeah.
know. Maybe I'll cut some things out, but honestly, I don't know. I kind of like to let things roll and then, you know, give the people the raw data and let them piece it together.
I
So
think
yeah, so the Dedekind definition can be shown to be equivalent to the other definition, where you sort of by induction, you sort of say, hey, if I'm not in bijection with n, for any set of n elements of my set, I can find a new one, and then a new one, and then a new one, and then there you use some kind of countable choice, and then you end up getting a countable number of elements, and then you can use the Hilbert Hotel trick to get a bijection with a proper subset. So this is kind of brilliant kind of trick.
hmm
But yeah, classically in classical set theory, Dedekind finite and normal finite, whatever you want to call it, Zermelo finite is are equivalent, modulo some form of choice. And so, okay, so we know what it is to be finite, and then you can sort of say, hey, let's assume there's an infinite set. Now that has to be an axiom, right? And it's very easy to see that it has to be an axiom because there is a model, right? You can apply for the first order logic. You can say, hey, give me a model that refutes this axiom, and that model is the set of all finite sets, hereditarily finite sets, I guess,
hmm
finite sets that only contain finite sets. And that is a model of the Zermelo-Fraenkel axioms, say, without, axiom of infinity. And great. So that means that axiom of infinity is really necessary. And what's worse is that proving that that axiom of infinity is consistent cannot be done, you know, with just kind of finitary reasoning, almost by definition, but in practice, you can show that like piano arithmetic is exactly as strong as the set of hereditarily finite sets, and in some very clear sense. And assuming the existence of an infinite set immediately proves that piano arithmetic is consistent. And then presto, apply the incompleteness theorem. If you could prove that the axiom of infinity is consistent, you could prove that piano arithmetic is consistent. You've done this in piano arithmetic. This contradicts the second incompleteness theorem. Um, and the only way to do that is if piano arithmetic is already inconsistent, which is abhorrent to any logician. Sorry,
Yeah,
that was kind of uh, a fast recap of this idea, but it's going to come up later when we talk about forcing, maybe.
the hereditarily finite sets, I do think is a fun idea, and it's like one that I feel is extremely concrete in the sense that you can implement most of it or a lot of it.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
Finite sets are like set data structures in whatever programming language of your choice, and in some, if your language is sufficiently generic or overloadable or something, you can have sets of sets of sets.
yeah.
Um, And so you can build the empty set, you can build the set of the empty set, you can build the set of the set of the empty set, programming wise. You can implement. So yeah, the axioms of
Yeah, these are like
ZF.
hash const trees, right?
Well, you don't have to be hash counting anything. That's like interning and avoiding only having a single object that corresponds to in memory that corresponds to like one construction. You
Yeah,
could
yeah, that's
have
fair.
you could have two empty sets that just aren't or two separate allocations and
Sure, sure, sure. Of
um,
course, in set theory, you explicitly want sets with the same elements to be equal.
well,
But in computer science, you could say, hey, there's equality that we want, which we implement, and then there's the equality that the computer wants that we typically don't care about.
yep. I mean, there's lots of notions of equality in computer science. And I think that's really fun. There's also lots of notions of equality in math, I think, over
Yeah,
kind
yeah,
of the
but
same
mathematicians spend
structure.
a lot of time trying to pretend that there's only one.
Yeah, I feel
Um,
like there's got to be some examples where like, yeah, they do really try to pretend there's only one. I was trying to like, what's the like the rationals? They're pairs of, or yeah, they're pairs of
yeah, that's
integers or
that's what
something. But
quotients are
like,
for, right?
that's what
Like
quotients do for you. Yeah,
quotients turn a notion of equality into the real equality. And let me
yep,
tell you, mathematicians do not like making that distinction. They really don't.
yeah,
At least up to, higher category theorists. But those, I feel, are kind of the rebels, the punks of the mathematical world.
yeah.
Sometimes you have to keep track of those equivalences. You do. And I've been reading books about combinatorics where they're like, these are equal, but they're equal in a special way. And we're not going to tell you. This is just intuition. Pretend we didn't say that. Hush, hush. But actually, we do care about these equalities, the content of this equality.
Is that like the context of like a formal power series or something, or something
For
more
example, yeah, in
complicated?
combinatorics, generally people will want to prove that, the set of x's such as y, the set of paths that only go down and to the right. You have a grid that's some rectangle. You want to count the set of paths that goes down to the right. You want to prove that that number of those things is equal to some expression that involves choose something, something. And they're like, okay, these two numbers are equal, but they're actually equal in kind of a nice way. And the nice way is that there's two sets that I can define, and those two sets are in bijection. And that bijection is natural up to some, replace the elements by some other elements or something. And they're like, okay, but remember that. And they call these natural proofs.
Hmm.
And they keep them in their heads and they write it down. But so far, at least, in this, 19, I don't know, 70s or 80s book, they do not write down the definition of what a natural proof is as a mathematical concept. Um, uh, of course they weren't dumb. They knew probably category theory had something to say about this, but again,
Yeah,
they wanted to keep those, outside as long as possible.
yeah. The
If you let
hounds,
them
the
in,
wolves at the
yeah,
door.
yeah, if you let them in once, they're never going away. All right, so blah blah blah.
The
All this is
rising
cool.
sea that we all drown in.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Uh, I'll explain that in some other podcast. Anyway, so great. So, Zermelo comes up with this set theory in 1904, but people already knew what set theory was. Before that, Cantor was kind of like, okay, you all know what sets are, we all know what sets are, but actually things are a little fiddly as soon as you start admitting infinite sets. And in particular, it's pretty easy to show that, the set of all subsets of something, which you really want to kind of consider to be a set, is not, you cannot possibly put that into bijection with the set itself, right? The set of all
Hmm.
subsets of the natural numbers cannot be counted by natural numbers, all right? And the proof of that is just blindingly simple. It is so simple, in fact, that it is one of the most reviled theorems by cranks because A, it says something very weird, which is there are two infinite sets which cannot possibly be put in a bijection. And people often state that by saying there are two infinite sets of different sizes. And that's not an unreasonable thing to say, right? You're just saying being of the same size really means being put, in one-to-one correspondence, lining up the elements. And you cannot do that for like the set of natural numbers and the set of subsets of natural numbers, or the set of natural numbers and the reals. Um, you really can't do that.
Hmm.
And so this is disturbing. It's a disturbing result a little bit, at least when you first learn it. I first heard of it in high school.
Yep.
And A. And B, the proof is like a 10-line proof. And so it's very upsetting to have such an easy proof of such a horrible result. And so people, the mind revolts. And sometimes people who aren't, mathematicians just they just don't accept that. There's some like something breaks. People will often go and crusade against the incompleteness theorem, but the incompleteness theorem is a little bit harder to state. It's a little bit harder to understand. And so I think, 10 times more people revolt against this proof because it's just right there in your face, right? It's just a few lines. And
Yep.
the proof basically goes something like this. Um, Imagine that there is a bijection between the set of natural numbers and the power set of natural numbers, the set of subsets. All right. So that means to each n, you associate a set, which I'm going to call Fn, maybe, or Sn. Let's call it Sn. Um, okay. Now define the set W. Let's define the set W to be the set of natural numbers. All right, it is a set of natural numbers. And it is the set of natural numbers, n, such that n is not in the set Sn. All right, so it's all the natural numbers who in this bijection are sent to a set that doesn't happen to contain them. Okay, great. That so far so good. We've assumed that there's some bijection. Okay, great. Sends a natural number to a set, and then we just defined a particular set, which is the numbers which are not in the set associated to them. Great. Now, because it's a bijection, right? Now we're going to use that fact. It must be the image of some number k, right? So there's some k that maps to that w. All right. And now the question is k in w or not? And I don't know. I'm going to kind of leave that as the punchline, but it's pretty easy to see that neither possibility really works out. If k is in w, then actually it cannot be in w because w exactly is the ones that exclude that possibility. And if k is not in w, then it must indeed be in W because W is exactly the set of numbers that involve that possibility. So you get two possibilities. Neither one can be the case, and so yeah. So this is kind of a hard step for students, but basically you get this contradiction, you get this impossibility. You know that you must reject one of your assumptions, and the only one that you can possibly reject is that you had this bijection in the first place. All right. And so I don't know, a proof that you can just say like this in a few lines is kind of unassailable, right? You cannot fight it. It's disturbing, but you can't fight
Well, you could fight it by like fighting
it.
the very foundations of logic or something, or like trying to be in a wackadoo smackadoo logic, maybe. I'm not
Yeah,
sure
yeah.
how wacka smackadoo it would have to be though.
It would have
Um,
to be pretty wackadoo. You
how
you are
smackadoo?
you do use you use variables multiple times in this proof, so you could be in a linear logic. And let's see, you do assume that you can define sets of natural numbers in this kind of comprehension way. So you could also reject that. And people have tried both. The first one is nuts, and the second one is inconvenient. All right, great. So that's step one. So Cantor proves this. People kind of digest it. They get pretty cranky. Kronecker in particular gets really cranky. Hilbert's like, okay, wow, this is super cool. Anyway, we need these infinite sets. We need them all over the place. We can't do math without them.
Hmm.
And so Cantor's like, okay, great. Also, I've defined the ordinals, and the ordinals have this really, interesting property that basically you can always, for any ordinal, you can look at the smallest next one. There's always one. Um, and then he defines cardinals, and he shows that, um, assuming choice, um, cardinals also have this property, right? Where there's, there for each set, there's a cardinal of that set, right? Which is, the ordinal of that size. Don't worry about it. Oh, sorry. What's going on?
Nothing.
All right.
Just a pause moment on yeah, you're willing to throw out ordinal or cardinal, and it doesn't even mean anything to you because you took it in with mama's milk or something somewhere in
Yeah,
high
yeah, sorry,
school,
sorry.
maybe college. Ordinal is a pretty new concept to me. I think I wasn't even particularly aware of ordinals being a concept. I was aware of cardinals being a concept.
Yeah, I'm
And
afraid that I agree that it's a non-trivial concept. I don't want to go into it too much because yeah, I don't know. Otherwise we'll be here until tomorrow.
yeah, okay.
So cardinal, the concept of cardinal is right, it's basically a representative of a class of bijections, right?
Hmm.
So, the same way we defined a finite set to be a set in bijection with a natural number, we can sort of do this for infinite sets where you say, hey, there's this generalization of natural numbers that we call the ordinals, and then take the ordinal that's in bijection with, the reals, that is the cardinal of the reals.
Yep.
And basically each class of sets will have some associated cardinal, which picks out its size. And what's kind of cool is that you can show that, um, yeah, size is this kind of discrete thing, right? It's not this continuous kind of there's no wiggle room, right? You're at a cardinality or you're at that, the next one up or the next one up or the next one up, etc. And yeah, there's an infinite number of them, but yeah, there is definitely for a given cardinal, there is the next one up and nothing in between, right? It's not like the rationals where you can always find one in between.
And yeah, but the interesting thing is the definition of cardinal didn't have a concept of next in it, but you do have a notion of ordering because, bijection is our notion
Right.
of equality of size. And the notion of being less than is if you can find an injective function from like the smaller one to the bigger one. I
Yeah.
am right? Okay, good.
Yeah. So
Um,
right. So it's not obvious that there's this notion of like the switch that you flip and to get the next one. But you can prove this. You can prove that for any cardinal, there is a next cardinal up. I don't
and it should
remember if you
be,
need choice for this, but I'm pretty sure you don't need choice for this.
yeah. That's interesting. And then I mean, we're going to talk about it anyway. Ordinals. It is almost the same idea, except now it's order. You need to have a notion of an ordering on your set, and it's order preserving bijections that you need to care about, right? So it's a very similar idea, but now it's order preserving. And almost ordinals are, in some respects, the more intuitive topic. I think there's an argument there that like it's highly unintuitive if you have a grid, you make this grid, right? This 2D grid of all of pairs of integers. And
Mhm.
there's this classic diagonal argument that like, oh, actually you can enumerate all the pairs of integers. And you're like, that's counterintuitive or something. It's like actually that's pretty weird. But
It is.
it's weird, but it's weird almost exactly because if you consider pairs of numbers lexicographically ordered, and then you say, is there an order preserving mapping between the integers and those? I think the answer is no.
Correct. The
No,
answer is no.
correct. Okay, so they have the same cardinality, the set of the pairs of the natural numbers and the natural numbers, but
Yeah,
given
yeah.
that particular ordering
Yeah,
of
you need to
lexicographic,
shuffle them in some crazy way.
you need to do crazy shuffling in order to do that, which
Hmm.
is the diagonaling.
Yeah.
So, from the ordinal, yeah, I don't know. From the order
All right.
preserving perspective, they're very different, but from the size perspective, they're the same. Or yeah, whichever one you want to call. Cardinal is usually one that's more like size, I think.
Yeah. So okay. So cardinal is size. It really says, a set is bigger than the other if there's no bijection from the big one to the small one, and there is an injection from the small one to the big one. And then again, this does use choice, but you can sort of say this behaves nicely like size, which is to say, if there's an injection in both directions, then there's a bijection, etc. Uh, anyway, all right, great. So now we know two things, right? There's this notion of cardinality. A cardinal has the next cardinal up. That is a theorem that I'm not going to prove, or indeed, I'm not sure I have the proof in my head. And we do know that there are at least two infinite cardinals, which is, the set of natural numbers and the cardinality of the set of subsets of the natural numbers, right?
Hmm.
Those two things have different sizes, so they must have different cardinalities. All right, and now the obvious question is that set of subsets of the natural numbers, is it the next one up? Is it the least cardinal greater than the cardinal of natural numbers? And um, basically here, this is what mathematicians do all the time. They look at things and they ask, are these the only things? Because we haven't noticed any others. And that is either lack of imagination or, a theorem, a fundamental theorem. There's a reason for why these two things, these are the only examples we've seen, right?
Hmm.
Like groups, um, groups of order, groups of where every element is of order two, right? Uh, all the examples you think of happen to be commutative, right? Now, is that because there aren't any non-commutative ones, or is it because, I just haven't cooked up a crazy enough example?
Yep.
So Cantor was like, well, okay. I mean, there's no way there's something in between, right? Natural numbers, sets of natural numbers. What what else could you have, right? Like some weird like sets with certain properties. I don't know, like what would those properties be? It's kind of hard to imagine. And then you start looking for examples, like subsets of the reals. They're hard to find. You start looking for weirder subsets of the reals, like non-measurable sets. So
Hmm.
Cantor was like, okay, this is like a pretty clear question. It's a pretty basic question about set theory. It is a very natural one, and it's just right there at the bottom of the questions you can ask in set theory, right? We're not even doing calculus yet. This is like should be easy.
Yep.
Cantor thinks about this for a while, and then he thinks about it for a long while, and then he thinks about it for a really long while, and changes his mind many times. And then, unrelatedly, goes to a lunatic asylum.
Yeah.
Anyway,
How unrelated? Hard
hard
to
to
say.
say. Uh, yeah. And he didn't go to an insane asylum. He went to a sanatorium, um, which I don't know.
Sounds
Victorian
cleaner.
time asylum does not sound like a fun experience.
No.
Anyway, Hilbert is like, okay, set theory is great. We need infinite sets all over the place. Everything, all the questions we're asking now involve talking about infinite sets. And maybe we don't like it, but man, is it effective. We really need to be able to talk about these sets and engage with them because, what else are we going to do? Like, even defining the reals without infinite sets is hard. And now we want to talk about sets of functions over the reals or measures over the reals, all sorts of infinite things. Um, okay, so he creates this list of problems, 23 problems, and he announces them. I forget where he announces them, some big mathematics colloquium. Question number one is the Cantor hypothesis. Are there any cardinalities between the set of natural numbers and the set of subset of natural numbers? That's question number one. That is his first, foremost pressing question. And Hilbert, like, Hilbert had questions about everything, right? He had questions about
Hmm.
algebra, calculus, number theory, other questions in logic, all sorts of stuff. But question number one was like, dang, what is this dang deal, right? Is it true or is it false? Um,
Yeah, he seems like a smart guy.
he he was. I, yeah. I mean, he was one of the most monumental figures in mathematics, right? It's just that's just a fact. Um, that being said, his contributions to logic are not monumental. Um,
I don't know. I mean, it seems like he's the person people were trying to like counter almost a
yeah,
lot.
he's the
He,
villain.
he was the villain. Yeah, he was the villain of logic.
I agree. This was an exciting time for like philosophy of mathematics. You know, Poincaré
Yeah.
was like, all this formless stuff is BS. And then Brouwerlight was like, oh, all this infinity stuff and this excluded middle stuff is BS. And Gödel was like, oh, by the way, there are some issues with your program to prove consistency of all of mathematics.
Hmm.
And so yeah, so attacked on all fronts. But of course, Gödel was the king. He is the one that figured out all these problems, and he cared about these questions in a very mathematical way, in a way that neither Brouwer nor Poincaré did. They cared about they cared about math, and they cared about the metaphysics of doing math.
Yeah.
But Gödel cared about the meta mathematics. He wanted to understand the logic. So anyway, Gödel proves the completeness theorem at I think 27 or 25. The incompleteness at 27 or 29. Basically, he could have stopped there and retired. Uh, I don't know, financially maybe not, but like certainly in terms of contributions, um, that was immortality right there. But in fairness, the mathematical sophistications of those proofs are relatively elementary, right? Both of those things are things you can teach to undergrads without too much pain.
Hmm.
So Goodall's like itching for a challenge in some sense. And he attacks this continuum hypothesis problem. Now, what's kind of cool is that Gödel almost immediately recognizes, despite his philosophical bent of being like, okay, the all these things are true or false, right? The incompleteness theorem is kind of like a fluke. It kind of says, okay, in a formal system, there are things that cannot be proven or disproven in these systems. But surely, God knows whether they're true or not, right? To Gödel, this is like a pretty real argument. Like he really does believe this. And um and so one could say, okay, well, how do we reconcile these two facts in our brain? Well, first of all, okay, formal systems, they have to be kind of finite or finitary in some sense. But that's because of our kind of human limitations. We just don't have time to write down all these things. However, what we can do is use our God-given intuition to try and understand whether these things are true. And for the incompleteness theorem, yeah, you can build a Gödel sentence which is neither provable or refutable in a given formal system. But that formal system, you can use your intuition to know whether it's consistent. And if it is, according to your intuition, you can just say, okay, well, therefore, the Gödel sentence is true, right? It's just true. And um, problem solved, right? And so now, okay, sometimes we have to rely on our intuition and evidence and, philosophical arguments for the truth of axioms. But that's okay because we have that. We have tons of intuition. And so one reasonable thing to ask is, okay, what does our intuition say, right, about the continuum hypothesis? Well, not much, but it does say quite a bit about the other axioms. All right, so now what? Now we either prove or disprove the continuum hypothesis, or we find that it's independent, in which case that's a problem because this is not like the Gödel sentence, right? This is not like the incompleteness theorem. This is an actual natural question that we ask. And so if it's independent, there's a problem here. That a problem that we need to solve somehow by saying, proving that it's equivalent to something that we do have intuition about. All right. So, the spoiler for this story is that they did prove that it was independent, and Gödel spent some time trying to establish this independence, and he did. He did establish one direction, and his student Cohen established the other direction, the much harder one. And then Gödel spent quite a bit of energy trying to understand, reconcile intuition with one way or another, the the truth, the real honest to God truth of this matter of fact. And in doing so, he basically founded the whole school of what modern set theorists are doing. Modern set theorists um, are just trying to fulfill this program of like finding axioms that we have intuition about and that tell us whether this thing is true or not true.
Hmm.
All right, so that was the intro. I don't know. I want to talk about the technical details, but how long have we been at this?
Like a while. Maybe that first part was wandering. So
This is the funner bit. I think talking about the technical details is going to be a little bit less fun.
yeah, so right. So Gödel and Cohen did two different things. I mean, related things about the continuum hypothesis. Gödel showed that it can't be proven to be true. Is that what he showed?
So if we consider the continuum hypothesis to be there is no intermediate cardinal between the set of natural numbers and the set of subsets of natural numbers, which is to say, yeah, the no intermediate cardinal. Then what Gödel showed is that it is consistent for that to be true. And what does that mean? It means that if you add this axiom, there is no intermediate cardinal, into the set of axioms of Zermelo-Fraenkel theory, then you cannot possibly get any additional contradictions, right? Because of the incompleteness theorem, we can't really know, right, whether Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory is consistent or not,
Hmm.
right? But if you assume that it is consistent, then you can prove that adding this axiom, that there's nothing in between, isn't inconsistent. All right. And that proves basically that either continuum hypothesis is provable directly, right? Or at least that, if Zermelo-Fraenkel is consistent, then it is not refutable, right? Does that make sense? I'm saying you
Yeah, there's
can't
a
prove the negation of that because otherwise adding it would give you a contradiction.
yeah, there's a funny grid of like what are the possibilities here. Sort of hard to put my finger on it. Um, someone give I mean, first of all,
No,
there's
I
like a
mean, I mean, the grid only has three lines, right? Either CH is provable, CH is refutable, or neither, right? Or you're inconsistent. Okay, four things.
okay, four things. And so what did Gödel prove
He
in that grid?
proved he excluded the fact that it is refutable.
Okay, so he excluded one of those four possibilities.
Correct. The last one you can't possibly exclude.
Right.
Zermelo-Fraenkel might be inconsistent. Nothing to be done about that. Right.
Okay.
So that leaves two more possibilities. Either you can
Hmm.
directly prove the continuum hypothesis. It is a theorem of Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory, or Zermelo-Fraenkel with choice. I'm going to take choice generally as a given for now. Or it's independent. You can prove neither direction. And by the time Gödel did his proof, people were leaning pretty strong on the independent side, but it was still not completely obvious that there wasn't some trick to show that, oh, actually, there's n really nothing in between.
Hmm.
So, okay. Um, yeah, so that's the basic story. I was hoping to start talking about how Gödel did this thing, right? How Gödel proved that you couldn't possibly prove that there was an intermediate cardinal in general. And yeah, I don't know. Let's give ourselves until 3 o'clock at least. So the basic strategy is apply the completeness theorem, right? Is the completeness theorem says, hey, if adding CH to Zermelo-Fraenkel is consistent, well then there better be a model of set theory in which CH holds, is actually true. Okay? And so that's the idea. Build a model in which the continuum hypothesis holds.
Hmm. I feel like there's
So
a lot of concepts at play here of like what is a model in this sense, and that or like just there's like some there is in this topic a lot of like the meta, there's like a meta ZF theory, and then there's like an inner thing you're sort of talking about at the same time. I mean, this is the topic of meta logic, I think,
yes.
generally.
So okay,
Um,
that's kind of true. What you can do is say, forget about ZF as your meta logic. Your meta logic is whatever you want it to be. In particular, all this can be carried out in a much, much weaker meta logic. Say whatever Agda has, or whatever Hilbert accepted, right? Some very weak meta logic where you can sort of reason combinatorially about things. Or say you
mhm.
have enough power to at least state the completeness theorem and prove it, say. That's still quite a bit weaker than Zermelo-Fraenkel. You can do this in any reasonable theory that allows you to, I don't know, talk about, yeah, models.
Did I do
Um,
it in Peano arithmetic?
kind of. It's
Okay.
awkward. Um, it's awkward, but it is possible, or at least you can do it in theories that are conservative or Peano arithmetic. Is that true? I think that's true. And okay, so if you have your meta theory allows you to talk about models and sets and stuff, and but those are the meta models. And then internally you say, okay, well, I'm going to take as a given that Zermelo-Fraenkel is consistent. Otherwise, you can prove whatever you want in it. And the completeness theorem at this point, the meta-theoretical completeness theorem, says there is a model of set theory. And now I can use that model maybe to build other models. Now, set theorists don't like to do this. They do like to work with models of set theory, but they like to work with special models called transitive models. And basically, a transitive model is a model in which every interpretation of a set is actually kind of a set that, in your meta logic.
Hmm.
And it is a transitive set. That is to say, the membership relation is the real membership relation. And um, yes, and every member of that that set that interprets, an element of your model is also a set that is in the interpretation of the model. So, okay. So that makes them happy because set theorists want set theory at every level, right? They want their models to be sets, they want their meta theory to be sets, they want everything to be sets. This, I think, complicates things actually. I would love to read an account of, the continuum hypothesis and these independence proofs such that sorry, I'm getting distracted. Such that, the meta logic is not Zermelo-Fraenkel. That way, at least, there's no risk of confusion.
Yeah, it is actually very enlightening sometimes to have like your inner logic and your outer logic be very different. Because again, there's no risk of confusion anymore. And yet almost everybody tries to like kind of bring them typically or bring them like really close together because you like get more for free that way. Like you can just overload everything. Kind of there's just like a backtick you can put somewhere that like, oh, now I'm talking about my object logic. Oh, now
Yeah,
but
yeah,
then
yeah.
like you like lose the thread and it's like unreadable.
Yeah, you do.
Um,
One thing that's annoying is that yeah, the most powerful use of this, right? It's like Lisp, right? Lisp is a
it's
beautiful
exactly this.
idea, but it's hard to read. And the powerful idea here is that you sort of want to say, hey, I'm going to reason in my meta logic, so I'm going to reason informally. But that reasoning informally, you do whatever mathematicians do, which is believe deeply to their core that if they really wanted to, they could make that thing formal. And
Hmm.
now, because you believe it could be made formal, it also must hold in like the inner model. And because that inner model satisfies all the things that you can prove, right? It's kind of the trick that computability theorists do when they say, "Oh, I'm going to describe an algorithm informally." But you know intuitively that you could turn this into a Turing machine if you really wanted to. Via the usual encodings. And
Hmm.
therefore, there is a Turing machine such that blah, blah, blah. So,
Yeah.
yeah. So anyway, there's another way to do this, which is sort of, let's see. You can define, so as instead of defining a model of set theory as a set, you could just not start assuming that there's a model of set theory. You could just say, I'm working in set theory. I'm working on the inside of this set theory thing. And I'm going to define a predicate, a P of X. And that P of X, is a predicate in first order logic, right? It's a concrete predicate. Um, And now instead of stating something in set theory, I'm going to preface all my quantifications with P of X, right? So instead of for all X, I'm going to say for all X, P of X implies. And for all my exists X, I'm going to say exists X such that P of X and, right? And so now I haven't assumed that I have a model of set theory. I've just worked inside set theory, but um, relative to this predicate, right?
Hmm.
And doing that, if I can prove all the relativized axioms of set theory, I've basically proven that all theorems of set theory can be relativized to that predicate. And therefore, I can translate all my theorems of set theory into this relativized version. And basically, I'm giving an algorithm of how to translate all my axioms and theorems of set theory into this thing. But because they're all relativized, maybe there are additional things that are true. Maybe one of those things happens to be the continuum hypothesis, in which case I will have proved relative consistency of the continuum hypothesis. Because if I take the logic with continuum hypothesis as an axiom, I can always translate back by using those relative versions, right? And then false is basically the same statement in both those versions.
Hmm.
Hey,
Hello.
I am recording, but I think people will be happy to see you. Also, I might not put the video up. Um, yeah. So that's exactly what Gödel did. He defined a predicate that prefaced all of these sets called constructibility. Then he proved that that thing satisfied all the axioms of Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory and also the continuum hypothesis. And then by carrying out this construction that I said, this translation, you've proven consistency of the continuum hypothesis. You haven't shown that it's provable because you haven't, proven the continuum hypothesis. You've proven that if I work relative to this predicate, the continuum hypothesis holds, but there's no reason that it holds without that for all sets.
That's neat.
It
This
is neat.
relativized predicate is, sort of a trick I've seen in more mundane, more mundane setting. I'm just like, kind of when you have like, I've seen this when you have like, you're working in force through logic and you kind of want to cut out a section of your domain as being like well formed or being like, yeah, talk about subsets of like some piece of your domain. The positive integers or positive reals or something like pos. If you want to quantify that there exists a pos, you just
Mhm.
insert those pos in the right place. For all positive integers, you just put the pos in the right place in that for all.
Yeah, correct.
Whereas the dependently type version, like it doesn't look like that. They can like sort of intrinsically bake in these pos sort of things into their quantifiers in a different way.
Sure.
Um,
I think morally it's similar, right?
Morally, but there is something a little hackier about it. Um,
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
this
And
is
I
this is
mean,
like an entire subsystem in my thingy. Uh, is this well-formed system where you can assign well-formedness predicates to sorts, and then they'll be auto-inserted in the existent for
yeah.
alls.
And we talked about finiteness at the beginning. You could qualify all your quantifiers by X is finite. And of
Exactly.
course, there are axioms you wouldn't be able to prove anymore, right? In particular, the axiom of infinity, which there is an infinite set. That one you wouldn't be able to prove. And so there
Yep.
you don't have you know, a translation there that satisfies all the axioms of set theory,
Hmm.
which is good because that would be bad.
Now, what is and constructability? This is getting this is at the very already we're at the very limits of my set theory knowledge. The constructability is like you use the basic constructions of set theory to get at this set is my impression of what that should mean. Like there's an axiom of pairing, there's an axiom that there's an empty set, there's an axiom. And so you could say like this set was made by one of these or by like compounding one of these. Is that what the constructibility predicate is defined as?
Yeah, it's definitely compounded. It Yeah, it's a little awkward. It's a definition by transfinite induction over the ordinals. And so
Oh
it is a
man.
little awkward. If you want to do this cleanly and precisely in a mathematical way, it's a little tedious because, first of all, the axioms of set theory don't really allow you to do this kind of clean, define a class of sets by, class induction over the class of ordinals. That's already awkward.
Hmm.
You can do it again by sort of saying, oh, ordinal being an ordinal is also a predicate, and I can qualify, my quantifiers with that. And then, there's this awkward theorem that's in every textbook that is, if you have a formula that defines for each ordinal, some set, then you can define, a function, predicate from ordinals to sets, which is not a function in set theory, but which is a thing, a formula that for every ordinal, there exists a set that satisfies this. And that predicate is the induction predicate. It's allowed to call itself, quote unquote, on smaller ordinals. And intuitively, this is kind of reasonable. Ordinals are exactly the things that you can define functions on by well-founded induction. They're by definition practically. And great. And so we need to do such a definition for the Gödel constructible sets. I think explaining exactly how this is, like the details of this, is just super counterproductive. It's
Hmm.
very confusing. You just say, okay, assume that you can define things by induction on all the ordinals, and that thing you define is not a set, it is a class. But that class, is basically a predicate that you can assume, a set satisfies. And for the constructible sets, it's not that hard, right? You say, okay, well, I'm going to define by induction on the ordinal. For zero, for the zero ordinal, I'm going to just take the empty set. And then at each stage, I'm going to define um, all the definable sets, right? All the constructible sets, right? So I'm going to take all the pairs and all the unions. And then I'm going to take all the subsets that are definable. So all the subsets that are definable by a formula, right? I'm not going to take all the subsets. I'm going to take all the subsets that have names. And by names, I mean there is a formula in first order logic, with the language of set theory that tells me which subset I'm picking out. And
Hmm.
that formula is allowed to refer to the sets that I've already defined, right? It's pretty easy to show that you can define that for finite sets, you get everything, right? You do this induction and you do it, omega many times, so a natural number of times. And basically, you get all the finite sets because everything is super explicit on the finite sets. For the same reason that finite sets are nice for computers, here you're going to really get all of the finite sets. Great. Um, and you're also going to get that first infinite set, which is the set of natural numbers. Great. So far, so good. And now you're in trouble. Now you're not necessarily going to get all of the subsets of the natural numbers. You're going to get something much
Hmm.
smaller because you're only going to allow those that are definable by a formula that refers to the previous sets and, that has a parameter. In particular, you can only possibly get a countable number of subsets of the natural numbers. This really threw me when I first discovered this. The omega plus one stage for the constructible hierarchy only gives you a countable number of subsets of the natural numbers. That's weird, right? Not you're like, well, okay, I've failed, right? I can't possibly build a model of ZF if I can only get a countable number of subsets of the natural numbers, because it's just not the case that there's only a countable number of subsets. Okay, however, you're iterating this procedure and you're iterating it as many times as there are ordinals, right? So in particular, you're going to hit the ordinal that is of the size of, the real numbers. And because you've iterated it such an absurd number of times, it's very unclear whether you're still missing any subsets of the natural numbers, right?
Hmm.
And indeed, it is consistent to assume that you haven't missed any. Once you finish this induction over all the ordinal numbers, um, it might be the case that you've gotten them all. Now, it might not be the case. You don't know that. What is true, but this is kind of mind-bending, is that if you work inside the universe that you've just constructed, All right. First of all, you can prove that this universe that you've just constructed satisfies all the axioms of set theory. That's not trivial, but it's true. All right. Second of all, you can prove, and this is really non-trivial, that within that universe, as far as it's concerned, all of the subsets are themselves constructible, which is to say that if you carry out this construction, you build all the constructible subsets, and then you restrict yourselves to that universe, and you carry out that construction again inside of it, you're going to get everything. Everything you already had, you're going to get it again. And you can prove that. This was like a really finicky sticking point in my understanding of this construction. The fact that as far as the constructible universe is concerned, it's all of its subsets are constructible. That was mind-bending to me, right? From the outside, of course, that's true, right? From the outside, yeah, you've built the constructible universe. Yeah, by definition, all of its sets are constructible. But from the
Hmm.
inside, you could imagine that if you repeat that construction from the inside, starting with the ordinals on the inside and doing it all on the inside, you might get even fewer sets, right? And you can imagine doing that again and again, each time getting thinner and thinner. But no, that is not what happens. If you do it once again from the inside, starting from the inside, then you get exactly the same thing, right? You've hit a fixed point.
Hmm.
And so in some sense, this constructible universe is like the kernel. It is the smallest thing you can possibly get with this kind of construction, right? There is no way to construct by iteration over the ordinals, by adding subsets, not all the subsets, but some of the subsets. There's no way to get a smaller universe that still satisfies all the axioms. All right. This has many consequences. Um, First of all, yeah, inside the smaller universe, you know that the every subset is constructible. Sorry, every set is constructible, and that gives you tons of information. In particular, if choice didn't hold in the outer universe, it must hold in the inner universe, and that's very easy to show. Basically, um, if you need to choose, you know that each set is named by basically a formula, right? So you just pick that formula, take the lexicographically smallest one, and that gives you a name that you get to choose on. That's kind of cool. And then another thing you can show is that the continuum hypothesis holds. You can show that there's nothing in between the set of natural numbers and the power set of natural numbers. And that is finickier to show. And I have to admit that I should have reviewed this, but off the top of my head, I don't really know how the proof goes. Basically, roughly, the fact that at each stage you're only adding a countable number of things, of nameable things, is going to really restrict you in how you get to build intermediate cardinalities. But that's not the whole story. There's something missing here. So maybe this is where we should stop it and say, I gotta go do my homework, figure out how this constructible universe satisfies the continuum hypothesis. And that was Gödel's big idea. What's cool is that he immediately realized, Gödel's very good at immediately realizing things, that this construction couldn't possibly have any hope of refuting the continuum hypothesis. He couldn't possibly hope to do this kind of trick, the same kind of trick, and build a model of not CH. There's some obstruction here that makes it impossible to like carry out the same idea. So now he's at an impasse, right? He's proven one direction, but he's also seen that his technique has a fundamental limitation, which is kind of cool. So now all these logicians are coming in trying to solve this really hard problem, and they know that this idea can't possibly work. This is a very uncomfortable position for mathematicians to be in, knowing that the only idea that they've ever had is like not going to work.
Hmm.
It's a very it's a very awkward way. Cohen writes beautifully, and he says this limitation that he had, actually he used it to inspire himself. All right, hit me. Final thoughts, ideas.
Um, yeah, it's fun stuff. Set theory's fun stuff.
You feel like
This,
it really took me a while to understand this idea of the constructible universe within the constructible universe. Just the fact that that thing could possibly make sense and be different was not obvious to me.
yeah, I don't think I can grasp that idea.
For example,
I
here's an
yet,
example.
but
It is easy to construct models of set theory that are countable, right? If there is any model of set theory, then there is one that is countable, right? That's true. But it is
mhm.
definitely not true that within that model, where that model believes that every set is countable. From within that model, it cannot possibly be consistent for it to believe that every set is countable, right? So what you know from the outside about the model and what the model knows about itself are two different things, right? This happens a lot in type theory where you're like, oh, I define a type theory. As far as I'm concerned, every function that that type theory can define is computable. It can be computed by a Turing machine. But is it consistent to assume that? That's not
Yeah,
obvious,
the idea of a model believing something, exactly how to think about that escapes me at the moment. Um,
right? This is a subtle point, and it is a point that can only really come up in situations where you're trying to look at the meta theory of a powerful theory of mathematics, right? That theory of
mhm.
mathematics can talk about things. And the things it can talk about are the same things, you know, mathematicians talk about. And the things that it believes are true are the relativized statements. And those things are not necessarily the same as the external statements. Sometimes they are. And in particular, one can show that certain relativized constructions always preserve this notion of external versus internal belief. That's the crucial insight. But yeah, explaining this is a little subtle, and I'm not sure that I understand it well enough to explain it well. But
It's
the
also hard
analogy
in
with
audio.
computability is strong, right? You can build a model of type theory where everything is computable, but from the inside of that type theory, it definitely does not believe that every function is computable. You certainly can't prove that. I think I've talked about this in my podcast.
Probably.
Yeah, there is a way, and this way is not completely unlike the set theory thing we just talked about, where you can build a model that does know that all its functions are computable, partial computable. Total computable, you cannot build such a model. It's inconsistent. But you can have a theory be convinced that its own function space is computable. In intuitionistic type theory, that's true of all models, right? All models are like can only define computable functions. But if you want the theory to know of itself that all its functions are computable, that's very different. It's kind of self-knowledge, right? Self-knowledge can be very dangerous. And there are some situations where it's so dangerous that it tears you up inside.
Indeed. Indeed.
I don't want to overextend that metaphor.
don't know thyself, you know?
Yeah, don't know thyself because you might go
That's
crazy.
that's inscribed on a rock somewhere.
All right, well, this was very fun. I have no idea how I'm gonna turn this into a podcast. Maybe I'll just do nothing, just throw it up there and be like, consume the most intimate moments of this conversation as you will.
Good.
I talked to
Yeah, but
Pedro
just
recently and he's like, yeah, I do a bunch of editing. It takes me hours. I'm like, no, I can't do that.
yeah, you're fine. I mean, do whatever is fun and I don't know. Things are what they are.
That's Phil's wisdom.
It is Phil's wisdom.